She's Lisa Emmerich, PhD. She's Chair of Liberal Studies, Associate Professor of Communications and English, and she's our author tonight. I first met Lisa in 2002 when I had her for my literary genres class on the Saturday program, and she intrigued me with her 10 to 12 versions of Cinderella from different cultures. She's kind of going into that tonight with her talk on Albina and Her Sisters. She's going to be talking about the medieval legend of Albina and her sisters who married against their will and who rebel by conspiring to kill their spouses. They're exiled for their crime. They float in a rudderless boat to an uninhabited island, which they name Albiana. They settle there, they consort with demons, and they create a race of giants. According to medieval tradition, it is these giants that are found and killed by the survivors of the Trojan War, who renamed the island Britain. So this story has survived over 230, it survives in over 230 manuscripts, mostly illustrated, which were popular in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. They appeared in French, Latin, Middle English, Welsh, and Dutch. The story has roots in classical myth, folklore, and romance, and she's going to discuss how the legend was adapted for different audiences over time and show us how cultures use stories to reflect their current needs and views of themselves. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Lisa tonight.
Thanks, Brianna, and thanks everyone for coming out. I've been looking forward to sharing. I've been working on this legend for a very long time, and I've been looking forward to sharing it with a more general audience instead of the few scholars that will probably read the book. I first read The Legend of Albina and Her Sisters nearly 30 years ago when I was an undergrad, and I was immediately intrigued by it. As I delved further into it in graduate school, I discovered it was widely known in the Middle Ages. However, it had not received much scholarly attention in the modern era, and there was no one place to turn to in order to learn about its sources, scope, or function as a piece of literature. My recently published book, Albina and Her Sisters, The Foundation of Albiana, is an attempt to rectify that lack. So tonight I want to give you a condensed version of the major highlights of my findings. Medieval chronicles were the history books of their day. They were used to present the memories, to preserve the memories of the past for the benefit of future generations. Chronicles were written to tell the stories of kings, cities, and even countries. Where there were continuous records, the writing of a chronicle was relatively easy. It was just a matter of research and compilation. However, if records were lost or non-existent, the chronicler had challenges to overcome. This was the case in Britain, a nation that had been ruled variously by Romans, Saxons, Danes, and Normans for a millennium leading up to the High Middle Ages. In the confusion and changing regimes, clear records of the island's history were not maintained. The most reliable histories either skipped centuries of material or began with the Norman conquest in the 11th century. In the 1130s, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth decided to write a continuous history of Britain in order to celebrate the glories of his country's past. Finding gaps in the standard histories, he filled them in with exciting legendary tales of past rulers, largely of his own creation. It is thanks to him that we have King Lear, later popularized by Shakespeare, as well as the basis for the full story of King Arthur. These fictionalized histories were very much a part of medieval chronicles, mixed in with verifiable historical events. One of Geoffrey's source texts, Nennius's History of the Britons, told a brief tale of a survivor of the Trojan War named Brutus, who traveled north across Europe to an island which he and his companions settled, naming it Britain. According to Nennius, that island was uninhabited except for a few giants. Geoffrey of Monmouth expanded this tale, adding dramatic elements and following it up with stories of mighty kings who succeeded Brutus, giving Britain a seamless history. Geoffrey's chronicle was and is entertaining and engrossing, and it became a bestseller of its day. By the late 1200s and early 1300s, Geoffrey's history was being adapted and translated and appearing in Latin, French, and English, the 3 languages of England in the Middle Ages. These histories became known as Brute Chronicles, known for their opening episode. However, questions seem to have arisen about those giants that Brutus and his companions found on their arrival. Where'd they come from? This appears to be the starting point for a new opening to the Brute Chronicles, the tale of Albina and Her Sisters. And this story, which, as Brianna just said, survives in over 230 manuscripts and in 5 languages, is the focus of my book. The story had 2 main versions in medieval times. The first is what I call the Greek version, in which an unnamed Greek king has 30 daughters, whom he decides to marry off all at once to neighboring noblemen. The daughters, displeased at having to marry men of lesser nobility than themselves, are rude to their husbands, who complain to their father-in-law. The king calls everyone in for an audience with him and scolds his daughters, which infuriates them even more. They plot to kill their husbands by slitting their throats while the men are sleeping, but the youngest sister repents and reveals the plot beforehand. The conspirators are punished by being set adrift in a rudderless boat. They float aimlessly in the sea and eventually land on the island that is now Britain, which the eldest sister, Albina, names Albion, after herself. Although the island is uninhabited by humans, there are devils living in the caves there, and these devils seduce the sisters and breed a race of giants. It is these giants that Brutus finds on his arrival. The second version of the Albina story, which I call the Syrian version, features a mighty king of Syria named Dioclesius, who has 33 daughters, the eldest of whom is a beautiful girl named Albina. Dioclesius marries his daughters off to lesser noblemen, and as before, the women are angered and behave rudely to their husbands. They're beaten by their husbands repeatedly, but stubbornly refuse to change their ways. After being scolded by their father for their rudeness, they plot to slit their husbands' throats, and at the suggestion of Albina. In this version, they actually commit the murders and are exiled by their furious father in a rudderless boat with half a year's worth of provisions. Again, they land on an island, named Albion. However, it is completely uninhabited except for wild animals on which the women live. They eventually crave the company of men. The devil sees this and sends incubi in the shape of men, who couple with the sisters and produce a race of giants, one of whom is named Gog Magog. These giants live in Albion until the coming of Brutus. Thank you. The Albina story simply appears in Chronicles in the late 1200s or early 1300s, seemingly out of the blue. As I began studying it, I went searching for a source or inspiration, but there's no one text that can be identified. Lacking that, I decided to break the story into its narrative elements to see where they might have come from and how they coalesced. First off is the name Albion for Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth, like his predecessors, glossed over the issue of the alternate name for Britain, simply weaving it into his narrative. When Brutus arrives, Geoffrey explains, "At this time the Isle of Britain was called Albion. It was uninhabited except for a few giants." The interchangeable use of the names Albion and Britain was common as far back as the classical era, with Britain representing the British Isles as a whole, while Albion referred to what is now England and Scotland. Greek writers Isidorus Caracensis, Pliny, and Ptolemy employ the name Albion, while a 4th century Roman writer, Rufus Sextus Aviensis, refers to Great Britain as Insula Albionum in his Ora Maritima. A Greek sailor named Pythias circumnavigated the British Isles circa 330 BC, later writing an account of his travels in which he almost exactly estimates the circumference of Great Britain, which he calls the island of the Albiones. Linguistically speaking, the name Albion is most often assumed to have been a reference to the whiteness of the cliffs on the southern shore of the island. It's this connection that appears in numerous medieval histories. Geoffrey, however, never offers any explanation for the name Albion or for the giants he claims were there, despite his notable predilection for explaining the derivations of place names. This gap in the supposed historical record must have provided a tempting opening for a narrative that could account for these anomalies while maintaining the adventurous, epic flavor of Geoffrey's style of history. Thus, the Albina story most likely was born. The most obvious inspiration for the legend is the Greek myth of Hypermnestra. Hypermnestra was one of 50 daughters of Danaus, a mythical Greek king. In a political showdown, Danaus was compelled to have his daughters marry the 50 sons of Aegyptus. Danaus agreed publicly, but commanded the women to kill their husbands on their wedding night. Only Hypermnestra refused, and she was saved while her 49 murderous sisters were condemned to an eternity in Hades, carrying leaky pitchers of water in a thankless, repetitive task. The Hypermnestra story is widely known in the classical era and survived in the Middle Ages via Ovid and some lesser-known compilers of myth. Both Boccaccio and Chaucer retold the tales, celebrating Hypermnestra's bravery, while other medieval writers focused on the sins of the 49 murderesses. So this tale certainly seems to have influenced the Albina legend. In fact, some medieval writers made that connection, commenting on the similarities. However, the Syrian version of the Albina tale wanders further off this classical inspiration. I've not been able to find a direct link to a setting in Syria rather than Greece. But Syria was becoming more widely known to British audiences in the 12th and 13th centuries as the Crusades continued. There also may have been a literary or folkloric inspiration for the belief that Britain had been settled by people from the eastern Mediterranean. One Welsh text, appearing in a manuscript dated to the 1300s, makes reference to an oppression of the island by a group from Arabia. Other literary texts may have provided the inspiration for some of the changes in the Albina narrative to fit the Syrian origins it depicts. The popular medieval tale of the Seven Sages of Rome, for example, may have supplied the name of the sisters' father, for it opens in the court of Diocletian, a noble emperor. The opening lines of an early 14th century Seven Sages version introducing Diocletian and his wife echo almost exactly the opening lines of the Albina narrative, calling Diocletian mighty and noble and his wife fair and beautiful. Albina and her sisters are punished for their crime by being exiled and set adrift in a rudderless boat. Such a punishment for serious crime is common in history, folklore, and literature. The modern English terms outcast and outlaw bear testament to such practices. An outcast, simply enough, is a person cast out or rejected, one rejected or cast off by his friends or society. Legally speaking, an outlaw is one put outside of the law and deprived of its benefits and protection, one under sentence of outlawry. The Oxford English Dictionary notes that outlawry, in its early use, denoted exile or banishment. A variety of medieval laws from Irish and Celtic traditions advocate banishment from society and homeland for serious crimes. And the specific mode of banishment via rudderless boat appears in folklore and literature and had actual legal precedents in the Middle Ages. Ancient Irish law, for example, discusses the criminal sea waif, a person who had been cast upon the sea to land somewhere after he'd been set adrift on it as a penalty for some crime, specifically manslaughter, for which he could not pay the requisite fine, or the murder of a kinsman. Similar punishments existed in Iceland, Bavaria, and England. The fact that Albina and her sisters arrived safely at an uninhabited island could show that they were saved by a higher power, or perhaps that they survived by chance. And rudderless boats were not just a feature of medieval laws, but of literary texts as well. The most famous English example is Chaucer's Constance in the Man of Law's Tale, with a parallel text in Gower's Confessio Amantis. Both writers place Constance in a naked ship without steering. The source behind their stories is Trevitt's Anglo-Norman Chronicle, in which Constance is placed in a ship without sail and without rudder and without any manner of human aid. Another example can be found in a Middle English account of the life of Mary Magdalene. Here she and her companions were put in a ship without steering or oars. In another instance, the romance of King Horn, the young hero is put in a ship without sail or rudder, which nevertheless conveys its passengers to safety. One especially widespread romance involving a journey in a boat without the normal means of navigation is that of Tristan, one of King Arthur's companions. After a battle in which he kills the giant Morholt, Tristan languishes in agony with a festering wound. Deciding to remove himself from his countrymen, he boards a ship that takes him to Ireland. In some versions of the tale, Tristan's boat is explicitly described as rudderless, while in other versions it is depicted as being without means of navigation. His journey becomes a voyage of healing as it brings him to his beloved Iseult and the restoration of his health. Through these literary precedents, it's possible to see the voyage of Albina and her sisters as both punishment and a second chance. They accept their penalty as conspirators to murder, while their unmapped journey leaves them to destiny, providing the occasion for either suffering and death or for new opportunities. In the Albina story, the women become adept at hunting wild game and then become wondrously fat, that's a quote, after feasting on the meat of the animals they kill. This obesity, the narrative tells us, leads them to carnal urgings. The connection between gluttony and lust was a topic of sermons in the Middle Ages and extended beyond sermon handbooks to literature. The early 15th century morality play, The Castle of Perseverance, this is an illustration, features the allegorical character Flesh, who is accompanied by gluttony and lechery. Lechery explains to mankind that when a man's flesh is well fed, lechery follows close behind. Doesn't make much sense. Likewise, in the Parson's Tale, Chaucer writes, "After gluttony then comes lechery, for these two sins are such close cousins that oftentimes they will not be separated." Albina and her sisters are joined by incubi, demonic spirits who impregnate them. Incubi were familiar figures in medieval literature and thought and became especially prevalent in both clerical and secular tales after 1100, peaking in the 12th and 13th centuries, coinciding with the blossoming of the Albina narrative. The conception of the Arthurian character Merlin is a well-known example from the literature of this time. In Robert de Boron's 13th century poem Merlin, for example, demons conspire to impregnate a woman in order to gain power on earth. The offspring of such unions were traditionally depicted as otherworldly, as in the case of Merlin, or monstrous, as in the case of Albina and her sisters' giant progeny. The inspiration for these giants engendered by demonic incubi and sinful mothers was most likely found in Genesis chapter 6, which says that there were giants in the earth in those days. After these sons of God had entered into the daughters of men, they created these offspring who were the powerful, renowned men of the past. Scholars have debated the origin of this tale in the Bible. The most likely source may have been related to the apocryphal book of Enoch. Chapter 6 of 1 Enoch relates the agreement made by 200 angels to seduce mortal women, resulting in giants as offspring. The daughters of men are described as being exceedingly beautiful, much like Albina and her sisters in their narrative. The giants the women engender overpower normal men, eating all their food and killing them violently. The giants then begin to ravage the earth, killing birds and animals, eating their flesh and drinking their blood. They proceeded to do the same thing to humans. In chapter 15, the giants, half divine and half mortal, are described as evil spirits roaming the earth, fighting against mortals and causing damage and suffering wherever they go. This series of transgressions prompts God to send the flood in order to cleanse the earth of the sinful race. Geoffrey of Monmouth provided a recognizable giant in the guise of Gog Magog, with whom the Trojan colonizers fight, and Gog Magog was then incorporated into the Albina story. The tradition of Gog Magog stems from the Bible, from which the name arose as conflation of a place, Magog, and a ruler, Gog. In Revelation, the two are often mentioned ambiguously as representatives of evil. Biblical commentators, romance writers, and chroniclers treated Gog and Magog variously as wicked races, cannibals, and barbarians. It is as Gog Magog, leader of the giants, that he appears in the Albina narrative. Curiously, Gog and Magog survive to this day in pageants held annually in London. Maintaining a tradition that dates back to the Middle Ages, effigies of the giants are paraded as part of the Lord Mayor's festivities, that's what's in the middle, and statues can be found on either side of the clock at the Church of St. Dunstan in the west on Fleet Street and in the Guildhall, and those are the Guildhall statues there. You now have a synopsis of what I argue are the sources and inspirations for the Albina legend. Like any folkloric tale, it cannot be traced back to one identifiable starting point, but instead is an amalgamation of traditional and literary elements blending into something new and useful for its audience. And like any good story, it grew and changed in its retellings. The earliest version of the Albina tale dates to the late 1200s or early 1300s and is in Anglo-Norman, the French spoken in England at that time. Thanks to its inclusion in the wildly popular Brut Chronicles, it was translated into both Latin and Middle English. One Welsh chronicler translated it into his language, and at the end of the Middle Ages, it also appeared in Dutch in a Chronicle of Holland. It appeared in a variety of chronicles outside of the Brut tradition, true, getting altered along the way as elements were added, dropped, or combined. In the Brut Chronicles themselves, the story was sometimes abbreviated or expanded. A particularly interesting addition is in a 15th century Middle English chronicle, which overall is extremely condensed. Its Albina story, however, is almost the original length and adds the gory detail that when the sisters captured wild animals on Albion, they did not cook them, but instead ate the meat raw and even drank the animal's blood. According to medical texts from the Middle Ages, this gluttonous devouring of blood by women could lead, as it does in the Albina narrative, to corrupt offspring, following the medieval medical belief that fetuses were comprised of ingested blood. People who fell prey to this vicious cycle of blood drinking were seen as monstrous and were depicted as such for political ends. In his chronicle, Matthew Paris describes the habits of Mongols in gruesome detail. These men are inhuman and of the nature of beasts, rather to be called monsters than men, thirsting after and drinking blood and tearing and devouring the flesh of dogs and human beings. They drink the blood which flows from their flocks and consider it a delicacy. The chronicler of the abbreviated Middle English Brut appears to have had this passage in mind as he added the raw meat eating and blood drinking to the list of transgressions committed by Albina and her sisters. This textual linking of the women to the infidels of Matthew Paris's text groups them under the category of non-Christians who must be vanquished. It is noteworthy that this Albina prologue is also unique in its rather ecumenical detail that the women pray to both Apollo and Muhammad before being set adrift in their rudderless boat. Other versions of the narratives specify just Apollo or anonymous gods. Further reading of the text also shows that this abbreviated chronicler's concern with ridding the land of infidels is woven throughout his history of early Britain. The biblical motifs I mentioned earlier attest to the Christian influences on the Albina narrative. The author of the short metrical chronicle seemed to have this viewpoint in mind, as evidenced by the references in that text to Christ and the devil. Of course, the story far predates Christianity, but never mind. The short metrical chronicle sets up an opposition of good and evil from the start. The inception of Albina's plot to kill her husband is sanctioned by the devil, while the youngest sister, refusing to take part in the conspiracy, cites her belief in Christ. In her eyes, God would not allow the killing. She explains, God, who sits the highest of all, will never let such a thing happen. The text also explains that the rudderless boat to which the remaining sisters are consigned is guided by God, and his will shall be done. Despite their good fortune in reaching the island safely, the women in this text do not embrace the Christianity that their youngest sister espouses, and they experience the arrival of the fiend of hell that was so foul, and the conception of their giant offspring. Here, as in all versions of the Albina narrative, Albina and her sisters, like Eve, represent the evil in the world. Another fruitful way to study the use of the Albina story is through the politics of nationalism. Medieval writers had a penchant for creating stories that explain the origins of places. This, of course, is a major function of the Albina story. It's a prequel. And the story of Albina is by no means the only prequel used to argue for an ancient history of a place or institution in the Middle Ages. For instance, some medieval historians strove to fabricate the earliest possible foundation dates and histories for the universities at Oxford and Cambridge, both of which in actuality were founded in the 12th century. The Chronicle from Hyde Abbey, however, states that Oxford was founded in 886 and was staffed by Saints Neot and Grimbold, overseen by King Alfred. Faced with this fictitious but impressive foundation tale, scholars in Cambridge retaliated with one of their own, dating it back even further to 636, when they claimed their university was founded by none other than St. Bede. Not to be outdone, a text called the Oxford Historiola settled this battle of foundational one-upmanship by taking Oxford's beginnings all the way back to Brutus. This completely spurious set of foundation narratives is a wonderful example of medieval writers' willingness and desire to take their histories back to the tradition of Brutus and his Trojan followers. The proliferation of the Albina prologue in the early 14th century further suggests that it may have been used as a rebuttal of the Scota legend, which attributes the foundation of Scotland to the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh, and which appeared in Latin and Middle Scots chronicles of Scottish history beginning in the mid-1300s. Scota's Egyptian ancestry, set in the time of Moses, was claimed to have predated Brutus's Trojan heritage. According to the tale, Scota was the daughter of Pharaoh, just the name, and married a ruler named Gaithalos at her father's request. She and Gaithalos traveled the world, eventually arriving in Ireland, where they founded a dynasty. Their descendants then ventured to the north of Britain, renaming it Scotland after Scota. Historically, throughout the later Middle Ages, Scotland and England were at war with each other, the English seeking dominion and the Scots seeking independence. Viewed from the English chronicler's perspective, the Albina legend, each time it was incorporated into a history, provided evidence of England's primacy over Scotland, since Albina claimed the entire island. Scottish chroniclers consistently argued that their founding mother predated Albion's, and some even went so far to argue that the English were demonic offspring of Albina and her sisters' giant children. The gender opposition between Albina and Brutus prologues naturally raises questions of matriarchy versus patriarchy. In a national history that's undeniably based on masculine rulership, the quelling of feminine rulership is to be expected. In their tale, Albina and her sisters effectively give up their paternal origins when they disobey their father, losing the land of their birth in the process. Their settlement of Albion is wholly feminine. At least for a time, they are denied the male companionship they come to desire, and in some versions of the text, the demonic spirits abandon them to their monstrous offspring. As the focal points of misogynist views, the women devolve from their ordered, privileged upbringing to near primitives who must hunt and gather for their food, and who transcend boundaries of civility by copulating with demonic figures. Lest their actions be seen as fleeting, they are left with reminders of their misdeeds, their giant progeny. Medieval texts that displayed misogynist representations were not at all rare. For instance, the anonymous French text, The Faults of Women, portrays women as both lovely and treacherous. This is a quote from it. Outwardly, she's well behaved, but by her nature, she's depraved. Her words are sweetness sugar-clad to lure a man and drive him mad. On the outside, she's religious. On the inside, keen and venomous. The sisters in most versions of the Albina narrative are described in similar terms, simultaneously beautiful and flawed. This contrary portrayal of women in the Foundation legend would have been familiar to readers accustomed to the traditions of both praising and denigrating women in the 13th and 14th centuries. The 15th century saw a move toward more empirically balanced writings with corresponding shift in the depiction of women. Such a shift also occurred in the Albina tradition, with Jean of Wavrin greatly expanding the Albina story in his chronicle, portraying all of the women as Amazons, figures to be both marveled at and admired for their strength and independence. This depiction was then incorporated into certain continental French romances which featured Britain. A similar tone was taken by Christine de Pizan in the Book of the City of Women, which depicts the Amazons as admirable founders of a society which measures up quite nicely to Troy. In Christine's text, the women of Scythia courageously assembled and took counsel among themselves and decided finally that thenceforth they would maintain their dominion by themselves without being subject to men. Training themselves in martial skills, the women became conquerors of neighboring lands, and their high fame spread everywhere. Even Hercules and Theseus, journeying from Greece to challenge these women, are awed by them and are beaten back by two of the Amazons in battle before rallying to take them prisoner. Full of admiration for this race of women, Theseus marries Hippolyta, establishing peace between Greece and Amazonia. The Albina of Jean of Wavrin's chronicle uses the precedent of Amazonia to persuade her sisters to rebel, stating, "If you will follow my advice, we shall, with the help of the gods, become the most feared and dreaded ladies in the East." The similarities between these two texts, in the order of the details presented and the admiring tone, are suggestive of the interest audiences must have been taking in the matriarchal story of the Amazons. Another mode for viewing the Albina narrative in the Chronicles is as a prequel to the Brutus tale, to which it was typically prefixed. The parallels between the two foundation narratives are clear, while the contrasts make Brutus's settling of the island more significant. Brutus is of noble lineage, the son of Silvius and grandson of Ascanius, himself the son of Aeneas. Likewise, the Albina tale opens in an ancient kingdom distant from Britain, ruled by a powerful figure. Before Brutus is born, his grandfather calls a seer to predict the sex of the baby, and the seer predicts an epic life for him, foretelling Brutus's causing the deaths of both his parents, his travels through many countries in exile, and his eventual greatness as a ruler. No such fame is forecast for Albina or her sisters. The women, however, seem to feel that superiority is their birthright. Their explanation for their unwillingness to submit to their husband's authority is that they are of higher birth and thus superior to them. This overweening pride, which appears early in the narrative, sets up the sisters' eventual downfall and their progeny's replacement by Brutus, a true hero. Brutus's killing of his father, albeit accidental, and subsequent exile is foreordained. Though tragic, it's shown as a necessary part of his journey through a life as a heroic figure. The mass murder or attempted murder by Albina and her sisters is not foretold. In the majority of versions, the women agree to kill their husbands en masse after just one discussion led by Albina. The rather sudden nature of the plot, unsanctioned by a higher power, highlights its criminality and offensiveness, again casting the women in a poor light compared to Brutus. Brutus's travels and his eventual destiny as a ruler of the distant land that has been inhabited only by a few giants are foretold to him in a vision of the goddess Diana. In the majority of versions, Albina and her sisters have no such divine reassurance, despite praying to Apollo, fortune, or other divine forces. It is only in the late chivalric chronicles that Albina claims to have had a vision of their future greatness in a distant land, thus itself another echo of the Brutus tradition. The sisters' lack of direction is amplified by their conveyance, the rudderless boat. Assured of his destiny, Brutus makes his way to Britain through many lands, establishing an ethos of power and dominion along the way. In contrast, many of the accounts of the Albina story that discuss the women's journey, the sisters are nearly starved and very much frightened by horrible storms. As Brutus travels across Europe, he gathers men around him, brave and courageous companions in battle, who are drawn to him by his charisma and other admirable qualities. He rewards their loyalty with gifts and praise. Albina's sisters, on the other hand, are simply dominated by her. It is their meek following of her proposal that leads to the group murder in the first place, and they continue this submission when they reach land, allowing her to take sovereignty of the island without argument. While Albina is certainly a leader, she rules by her precedence of birth rather than by any admirable qualities of personality. She always speaks first and takes the lead in their actions as a group, with no consideration of her sisters' wishes. Her sisters, except sometimes the youngest, follow her commands without protest. Brutus's companions, on the other hand, are drawn to him as he travels across the continent and choose to join him in his adventures. When read in tandem with the Albina prologue, the Brutus prologue can become a narrative with Christian overtones, despite its hero's pagan background, recounting an ancestral hero's journey to a flawed world to initiate a new era, arriving to lead Britain to a better future. These examples of approaches toward the Albina tradition illustrate the versatility and rhetorical potential of this foundation legend. Over the centuries, it changed in form, crossed into a variety of languages, shifted its features and focus to fit in with a wide variety of chronicle texts. Such a variation is not a symptom of narrative instability, but instead a demonstration of the chronicle genre's amazing capacity for adaptation as a tool for recounting the past, whether real or imagined. As chroniclers compiled histories of Britain, they adapted the Albina tale to meet current rhetorical needs and audiences' interests, from political commentary to gender depictions to patriotism. The recounting of ancient origins stemmed from the nationalistic motive for research into the remote past. The transmission of the Albina narrative in these chronicles enhances the prestige of Britain and, by extension, England. At the same time, the tale serves to reinforce societal structures fundamental to England over a period of 2 centuries. Throughout the story's growth and adaptations, its focus on the sisters' poor behavior and misdeeds, with the ensuing punishments, reinforces the status quo in existing systems of morality, politics, and patriarchy. While maintaining that consistent function, the tale of Albina and her sisters is a vibrant tradition that, like many medieval narratives, took on different shapes over the centuries to meet a variety of textual needs and tastes. However, these tastes began to change in the Renaissance. Initially, the Albina story received a late boost in popularity with William Caxton's printing of the Chronicles of England in 1480. The same year, Caxton published the Description of Britain, which purported to be a version of Higden's Polychronicon. In addition to Higden's material, this overview of the nation's history included a reference to the Syrian version of the Albina narrative. Both the Chronicles of England and the Description of Britain were revised and reprinted repeatedly in the 15th and early 16th centuries, making the Albina tale more accessible to a wider readership than ever before. At the same time, many antiquarians searched enthusiastically through medieval manuscripts for evidence of their nation's earliest history. While eager for detail, they were not always willing to accept the legendary portions of the Chronicles. The majority of them, in fact, were openly hostile toward these stories. Others, however, are more selective and critical. In his chronicle published in 1516, Robert Fabian discredited the Albina tale, preferring the prosaic explanation that the White Cliffs were the source for the name Albion. John Major, author of the 1521 History of Great Britain, dealt equally firmly with the traditions of both Albina and Brutus, dismissing them as nonsensical. In a critique of Caxton's version of the Brut Chronicle, he demands, "For where shall you find 33 daughters born of one woman? How shall you believe that these slew every one her husband, and that set adrift without so much as an oar on a boundless ocean, they did not utterly perish?" Similarly, around 1540, John Leland and his colleague Robert Bale set out to catalog the writers and writings of British history as completely as possible. They called the Albina story a fable. John Price, writing in 1573, adopted a similar viewpoint, saying, "Indeed, it is a fable regarding Albina and her sisters who came from Greece." However, like many before him, he maintained his belief in Brutus as a historical figure, saying, "Britain is taken from Brutus, and Albion was named for the White Rocks." Holinshed, whose history was used extensively by Shakespeare, agreed. The death knell for the Albina story was struck by two great English writers, Spenser and Milton. In The Faerie Queene, published in 1590, Spenser admits the existence of the giants, but cautions us against that monstrous error that Diocletian's 50 daughters into this land by chance have driven been. In his History of Britain, published in 1670, Milton discusses Latin geography written in the first century by Pomponius Mela, which tells of a battle fought by Hercules against Alabion, a son of Neptune. Milton comments that he would rather believe Mela's tale than the absurd and gross, that's his words, story of Albina, calling it a fond invention dreamt up by a writer who, not pleased with the obscure beginning which truest antiquity affords the nation, labored to contrive us a pedigree, as he thought, more noble. This dismissal became universal in the 18th century, and the legend of Albina and her sisters faded from public memory. I would argue, however, that the legend is not without value. It's not only entertaining, but it also gives us a glimpse into the likes and dislikes of the audiences for whom it was compiled and translated. And as we study their interests and preferences, we can't help but look at and reflect on our own and how we reveal them in our narratives. After all, literature in its many forms is a mirror of the culture that produces it and of the successive cultures that preserve it and adapt it for their own needs. Thank you.